up there in Concord. You had one in particular, Kevin, that you wanted to say.
Yeah, today I think the House is flooded with a whole bunch of issues, actually, and this is one that that is kind of troubling. It's called a CACR, basically an amendment to the Constitution.
Right. Which is a very serious and hard thing to get through.
It's very serious, it's very hard just to get past the legislature, let alone the people, because it will be on the ballot if it does pass. But I find it a little troubling. And it has to do with what people would call reproduction rights. It's called reproductive medical decisions. And the thing is, reproduction, basically, we already have these rights. People have the right to reproduce all they want. They have a right to go to medical, and get medical coverage anywhere they want. But they want to put this into the Constitution. But it limits anybody from giving parental consent if they want to have an abortion. It limits,
I always wondered why they call that reproduction rights if you're not reproducing.
Right. This is in China, where China says you can only have one child.
Right.
And this is America, and you can have as many as you want. But that is a twist on the English language to create a sense of victimhood, right? Because of an inconvenience. And now, granted that people do go through some hard times. Some people have been raped, and that's a tragedy. But life starts at conception, and the baby didn't make that choice.
Right.
But this CACR 14,
There's a lot of people would like to adopt babies.
right, there are more people that would prefer to adopt than to than abortions. So. Beth Scare, she's a local resident. She actually testified today up at the Capitol, and she wrote this letter, and I thought it was pretty appropriate. It says, "Dear members of the House Judiciary Committee, if CACR 14 passes, the New Hampshire Constitution would state the right to make personal reproductive medical decisions is inviolate and fundamental to the human condition. Neither the state nor any political subdivision shall infringe upon the duly inconvenience this right. This would mean that there would be no more parental notification for minors having abortions." And I want to stop right there for a second. That means parents can't say no. They have no decision making. These children can then be brought there. Now, in an age where we're worried more and more about sex trafficking, this is their dream type of legislation, because there's no accountability. There's no accountability to the parents. There's no accountability to the public. These people can go under the cover, and Planned Parenthood and the abortion mills are abating and helping with this type of.
They could just walk in with their child, no identification, that the child doesn't belong to them, or doesn't, it's not of their family.
No questions asked.
Right.
I had my granddaughter. I brought her to Claire's here at the mall, and I had to get her ears pierced. I had to sign a consent form.
Yeah.
Everybody had to cover their butts.
Right.
For medical and for lawsuits, but you can kill a human life.
Right.
Without any kind of accountability. She goes on to say it would mean that New Hampshire taxpayers would be forced to pay for abortions. So that tax dollars would go to Planned Parenthood, which also happens to fund the Democratic Party. This year alone, they're promising to put out $45 million to support one party. So that's a cash windfall for the Democratic Party. And again, put into the Constitution. The people have to see this. This is what goes on up at the Capitol. Things matter, votes matter, and people getting involved matter. And I applaud Beth for going there. She says that it would also mean an end to ban of partial birth abortions. So if a child is halfway out of utero, halfway out of the matrix, they, seconds before it's born, it can be terminated.
Right.
And if you've seen the procedures, or seen,
how
pictures,
crude it is.
It's barbaric.
Right.
It's going back to the Stone Age. This is a wickedness that is beyond measure. It would mean an end to ban on partial birth abortions, and it would mean that we would have no future restrictions of any kind of abortions, not even third trimester. The vast majority of people support restrictions on third trimester abortions because ultrasounds are ubiquitous. They see clearly the humanity of the baby a few weeks from being born. Imagine how many more would support restrictions if they knew the third trimester abortions cannot be used to save a mother's life. And she goes on, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I think this is a really important issue. And of course,
Well, it's something that our listeners should be writing to their representatives.
well, yeah, if you want your tax dollars to be going to,
Right.
to something to this effect, the bottom line is you're really cutting into the conscience of a vast majority of individuals. Whether you are faith or not, you're encroaching upon a very sacred area for a number of people that don't want to support this. I, for one, do not. I think it's a tragedy. We've had over 60 million abortions since this whole nightmare's started. And people say, well, rape and incest, but if you even set that aside, that's about 2% of the entire amount. It's an industry, and when there's industry, follow the money. There's a lot of money that's involved with this, and we saw how that some of these abortion mills were selling baby parts on the black market, and did we just forget that? This is like out of when years ago we saw the scary movie Coma, because they were using parts of human beings. This stuff is coming to real life. People are being harvested.
Well, even the technique of abortion is being perfected so that they have more tissue to sell.
More tissue, and it's interesting. Some people were engaged in a long conversation with regards to this, and something really grossed me out. They were talking about people actually having going through as far a trimester as they could possibly go, aborting the child, and having it frozen, using it for their own body parts. You can't make this up. No. This is a horror movie that gone really bad, and the fact that they want the New Hampshire taxpayers to pay for it, illegal people doing really bad things to young ladies, sex trafficking, and then taking them to these places, that's aiding and abetting. Right. And that's happening. People are talking more and more about what's going on. Just this week alone, there was a young lady in Massachusetts. She was kidnapped coming from school, and there was a couple that stole her. There was an Amber Alert, and somebody saw them, and they called it in, and then they chased the person, and finally they got them. But they were going to steal this young little girl. I think she was like 12 years old. It was all over the Massachusetts web. That little girl had a price tag, and she was going to be used or abused. And that's happening everywhere. There are thousands and thousands of boys and girls that are being trafficked across the country. So I think this is their dream type of legislation. And I think people need to think soberly before they allow your legislatures to allow this type of thing to go on. I think there's a cruelty, and I think there's a hardness of heart that allows people to put stuff like out.
I agree with you there. I find it hard to believe that they even think that what might happen, that they're thinking they're doing a good thing here, and it's not a good thing.
You have to really turn a blind eye to reason if you think the whole thing through. And I think, again, this is something that I applaud. There were a number of people that came out to testify against it, and people have to speak up. Otherwise, this type of garbage will come through. So, whole host of other things that are going on.
Oh, there's a mess of things here. You're reading the paper, and I know not many people read papers anymore, but
we have this thing called a cell phone. It's cool.
There's even an editorial says that keep the government in check, buy your newspaper. So, I mean, That's one way of getting these opinions out there, but most of the people use social media and all sorts of things, and there's no controls over those.
Right.
But you have to look at some of these things, and there are good editorials. And one of the things that I picked up from the union leader just a few days ago, Democrats' economic message is preposterous.
Okay.
Talking about all the things that they're going to fund, you know, where they got this that's going to cost $10 trillion over 10 years or something like that. That's us paying for that. That's all that's doing is mounting up the debt or whatever, and there's no analysis that's being done. Numbers are played out, you know, purely out of the sky. You know,
I'm not an economist, but I know that when the federal government is $21 trillion, that's just on our national debt. That has nothing to do with the
there's a lot of other things
that are
that's affecting it, and pensions.
Well, I was going to say pensions. People are really worried
Right.
about the funding of the pension programs
Right.
and how are they going to keep it solvent. At some point, we're going to have to pay for this. At some point, somebody's going to have to pay for this. So adding all these new taxes, Elizabeth Warren and everybody on the stage said they want to allow Medicare for illegals.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the people that have paid into the system with their Social Security were paid, now that gets watered down even more. And we know that Social Security isn't necessarily going to be solvent, probably.
Right.
We've been saying this for a long time. Is this the one that breaks the straw,
Yeah.
the straw that breaks
I
the
think
camel's
so.
back? At some point, the people will be crushed in this country.
And they talk about all these multi-billionaires that are going to make a contribution. Well, you can take all their money. They do better with it if you increase the amount of charitable donations. They'll do a better analysis on spending their money and taking care of some of these charities, some of the hospitals, some of the schools, than the government does.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, the government, since they've taken over education and
Right.
healthcare, let's see, the prices it hasn't gone down.
Well, they give it in a way that it's a one service company. You have no competition. There's no initiative to make sure you're cutting costs. You're getting rid of false claims and stuff like that. Now, how many things in Medicare, for example, been paying money out to false and people? You remember 60 Minutes a couple years ago?
Well, 60 Minutes, and just here locally, I
Yeah.
interviewed somebody on my television show, and she wrote a book about it because she worked for the system for 30 years, ripping the face off of Medicare fraud.
Well.
There are scammers out there.
Right.
We were talking off air about panhandling, and sometimes we want to help those that are it's hard to discern, but people scam.
Right.
There's some people that will take the help, that will, thank you very much, and there's some that'll take the money and go off and take drugs. So the system isn't any different.
Well, you don't give somebody who can't control money a monopoly to provide the service, okay?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if you had a company do that, they'd be prosecuted. They'd be put in jail. There's no monopolies out there, and that's even if you only have 50%, they call it a monopoly. And so we only have one medical treatment, and they want to do Medicare for everybody, including illegal aliens.
And that's just national suicide.
Right.
Go to Russia. See if you can get in there and ask for benefits. Go to Venezuela. Hey, there's a good one.
Yeah.
India, anywhere. Go to any other country and ask for, well, we're the richest country. Yeah, you know why? Because we're a free market.
Right. There's competition.
And there's competitions.
Technology.
We have
there's
laws.
Everything. Yeah.
And
then they let the government be absolved of the law.
So I think we're in for some real serious trouble. And, you watch some of these old movies, Carl, and I've just been watching a lot of World War II movies lately, and And I'm just, even from the First World War, and I'm thinking about these guys that were in the foxholes and just, stunned, they're bleeding or they're suffering, and they were there to protect our freedoms. They wanted to protect us from socialism, from Marxism,
Oh, yeah.
from communism, from Nazism, from those huge threats
Right.
that wanted to dominate our country and Europe. So what do? Well, we got Bernie.
We have the more socialists coming in, and I don't see how people can not see the past. People don't read about the past.
They don't.
There hasn't been one of those areas of government that has succeeded.
I went to Bible college with a kid, Clint Benoit. He went to Venezuela. He and his wife to become missionaries, and they were there at its most prosperous time.
Yeah.
And they had to flee because of what socialism did. They watched it before their very eyes. They actually went to Paraguay after, which is they actually protect their borders, but they watched it disintegrate. And the corruption that it bred. And what happens is you get this elite populace that says they're going to give you everything. They promise you everything. And then all of a sudden, after all your rights are gone, after the markets have been taken over, after the cronies have been put into place, you got no say.
Yeah.
You're and it just crumbles and crumbles. And we saw what happened there. I interrupted you, though.
Well, no, I'm just saying that socialism doesn't work. Any form of it, any form of the other controls where you have a czar or whatever they want to call themselves. They might even call themselves a president because they get a phony election. But when you know all that and you see what's happening, I don't understand how some of those people can propose those things.
I think people right now, even in the university systems, and they're saying to themselves, "Well, we're smarter.
Yeah, right.
We're better. We know how to do it right because look at all the information that we have, and on and on and on." And I'm thinking, that's pride, and pride before pride goes destruction, right?
That's
No,
right,
the spirit
right.
before a fall.
I was looking for a sentence in here. It said that you talked about that. I can't find that right now, but essentially what it was saying is that the only people who believe some of these stories are the ultra-intelligent college professors.
The ultra, yeah. I see Elizabeth Warren, she's out there saying, we're going to get rid of that college debt for you. Do you remember what happened to the American Indians? When the government told them, well, we're going to promise you this and we're going to promise you that.
Right.
The government that can give you everything is the same government that can take everything away from you.
Right.
And
people don't realize that. Maybe we're a little bit older here and we've seen a lot of this stuff. They're a little bit younger, but there's a lot of older people there, as you said, Bernie and Elizabeth and a few others that are preaching something that I think deep in their hearts know is not going to succeed.
No, but there is this push for power, and I think that everybody's it's funny, everybody's in this impeachment thing. They're all calling this virtuous thing called the Constitution.
Right.
The Constitution. In the meantime, they're trying to take away your Second Amendment rights.
Right.
They're trying to limit speech. They've been spying on individuals forever now. In the past administration has just been spying recklessly on individuals. So the Constitution. Back up what you say with actions. Why don't you protect the Second Amendment? Why are you fighting against it?
What happened to due process?
It's not. It's just words now. People are wordsmiths, and they're creating narratives to gain power. And rather than serving the people, we elect them to protect us from foreign and domestic enemies,
Right.
to protect us and to help us with border disputes between the states. They're not supposed to be in education. They're not supposed to be in a host of other things that they're engaged in, but somehow they've gotten into every aspect of our lives.
They want control,
and
as
they
you
want
say.
control. That's why I was so opposed to this Obamacare, because once they can tell you what's covered and what isn't, you know, they can
Again,
control your
monopoly.
actions. Right. And I think the third party system probably lended itself to this demise, because the third parties were, you know, the insurance companies were saying you can have this and you can't have that, and people got used to that. And then the government says, "Hey, that's a great idea. Now we can control your behavior." And I think that it's, you know, it's just something that you look back and you say, "Oh my gosh, Hitler did the same thing. Why are we doing that?" You know. So
Well, there's one other thing I'd like to bring up before we close out. One thing that I hear that the governor and some of the different legislators are looking in how they may import drugs from Canada using Canadian prices. That's another thing that sort of is out of hand because of the controls that are put on by our government on the manufacturers. Like you can't use. You can't go out competitively and try to get the best price for your drugs.
But at the same time, they can go across seas and create these drugs and use very, very cheap labor to do whatever they're doing in manufacturing. And the European countries and all the other countries are enjoying what we seem to be subsidizing, if I understand it. It's a complicated issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to price drugs because the fact is that most of the things that start out as a potential drug fail. And there's a lot of money that goes into
research,
doing the tests, the research, the testing. Everything takes years. And I've worked for a company where we had a big potential product, worked well in animals, and when we put it into a human being, it didn't work the same way. We found out that the 6 different animals that we had used, and which were normally the ones you use for, didn't have the same part. It was something that had to do with the heart, and the heart tissue is most similar in pigs, believe it or not.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And that's what you should have used. It would have failed in the pig. So we fortunately did take us another 5 years before we got a drug out that worked the way we wanted it to work, and now is saving a lot of people from heart attacks.
Well, I think the president signed some kind of legislation recently that if you want to engage in using an experimental drug, you have that right to do it if it'll save your life. And, you know, if he does something good like that, you know, give the guy credit. You know, I was talking to a neighbor, an old neighbor of mine, and I was cleaning her carpets, and we were just talking, and she had mentioned she's as about like down the middle as possible, and not controversial, just the sweetest lady. And she said, "You know, I just said something good about the president, and some of my friends just unfriended me." And I thought, "Wow, you? Yeah, it's just like then they slam you. Well, he can't do anything right." Well, tell the stock market that. You know, it's up to 29. Did anybody think we're going to get there? People are actually predicting 3,000.
30,000.
Or 30,000, I mean, yeah. But, you know, I think you got to give the guy credit when he does something right. And this was just a small example, but you were talking about regulations and
Right.
well, here's
He's
a way.
got a lot of regulations.
Yeah, if you can cut through the red tape, you can get a lot of things done. And I think that's something that we as a country have to sit back and say, look, what are we doing wrong here? Maybe we're over-regulating. Maybe we're too high on our horses saying, oh, this is...
And he's going after the different countries that had a favorable trade for them, not for
Like
us.
China.
And how many of those have been changed? And that's, you know, I think there's a lot of things that they've handled better without telling the people exactly, making a big thing out of it. You can go back into military actions, you can go back into trade actions, you can go back into political support or whatever. But I think that on the whole, we have many more pluses than minuses in here.
I agree. And, you know, I haven't been on Twitter for forever, so I don't care. Tweet, chirp, do whatever. You know, I think he's getting the job done. And if you look back through history and you look at a lot of the great leaders that got things done, they weren't saints. A lot of them were not.
Go back to the ones that they keep on talking about being a favorite. Kennedy, Johnson. Those guys, if they had the attitude that the people have today, they wouldn't have survived.
They would be considered hard right. They literally compared to what's going on today. And I don't think Jack Kennedy. I know Bernie quoted Jack Kennedy the other day. Jack Kennedy would not support Bernie. I mean,
No.
I wasn't around when.
No, he was a bit of a businessman too.
Yeah.
He knew that because his father was in illegal businesses, but he was in businesses.
He was an entrepreneur. But Ronald Reagan was a Democrat during the time when, and he adopted some of Jack Kennedy's policies. One was to reduce taxes,
Right.
and look what happens.
Yeah.
So.
And you can see that, and what followed Reagan wasn't very probable because people wanted to experiment again with somebody who had some wild ideas, and it didn't work.
No.
Our interest rates went up like crazy. I don't know if people remember 20% interest for a mortgage.
I remember the long gas lines.
Oh, yeah.
But this was the Carter time. This is the Carter period.
that's it.
And I remember actually standing in line right around the corner with a gas can.
Yeah.
Because we lived right around the corner, and the traffic went all the way up to Hollis Street.
Yeah.
People were there, and it was just go stand in line. But gas was cheap, but there was still lines.
Well, we got to have more talks about some of this, and maybe the people have to get more involved with what's happening out there. 'Cause we're coming up with an election. We're coming up with a primary in a few weeks, and we have elections in the fall. Please get out, look at who's running, and try to get our organization here in the state into a correct area where we're progressing as much as some of the other countries.
Yeah, and please don't leave the state. Just stay here and vote. That's all you got to do. Stay here and vote.
Right.
People are fleeing.
Right.
We want you to stay in New Hampshire and help us in this battle and keep it the live for your die state. So thanks for having me.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.